Across the globe, a new generation is stepping into the political spotlight, not through parties or parliaments, but through protest. From Nepal and Madagascar to Angola and Morocco, Gen Z-led protest movements have emerged in response to corruption, exclusion, and economic pressure. But unlike the structured protests of past generations, these are fast-moving, decentralised, and often leaderless, driven by digital coordination and a shared generational identity. What makes these movements so different, and what can we expect in the months ahead? To explore how Gen Z is disrupting political norms and influencing operational risk, here's our in-house intelligence analyst, Joshua George.
Gen Z came of age really around the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, which has left many of them in economic precarity. There are generally widespread frustrations which are common across numerous continents, primarily recently Africa and Asia. As these frustrations include corruption, inequality, unemployment, nepotism, rising cost of living, and the harsh treatment by security forces. And across various countries, young people face disproportionate unemployment and exclusion from the political system. If you're adding to this, many in Gen Z are often better educated than previous generations, many at university. They face perceived unfair underemployment and joblessness. In recent months, we've seen widespread Gen Z-led protests across Asia and Africa in particular, but primarily Indonesia, Philippines, Timor-Leste, Morocco, Peru. But in my opinion, the most significant two are Nepal and Madagascar in September and October of this year. In both countries, there were the underlying issues of widespread youth frustration, unemployment, perceptions of corruption. In Nepal, the trigger was a government ban of numerous social media platforms for failing to register with the authorities. Protests quickly escalated, and by day 2, there had already been numerous resignations, including the Prime Minister and numerous other members of government. The military eventually came to negotiate with the Gen Z representatives. Interestingly, they elected their new Prime Minister via Discord, which epitomizes Gen Z's methods in its protests. And then secondly, in Madagascar, protests were sparked for widespread power and water cuts in Antananarivo. These quickly escalated into broader Gen Z frustrations. The president attempted to placate protesters by replacing the prime minister, but this did nothing really to placate the protests, and they continued until a military coup deposed the president. Now it is likely, we're seeing now that the new president, interim president, has appointed a new prime minister. Gen Z are still rejecting this, so further protests are highly likely. First of all, it's just important to differentiate them from previous generations, such as the Gen X protests, which were typically structured and conducted through unions, political opposition parties, and religious groups. Communication was conducted manually through flyers and word of mouth, and they were typically slow to mobilize. However, they were generally led top down by an opposition figure and often became quite sustained once they built up the momentum. However, this also constituted a key vulnerability because decapitating the group by arresting the leader could quickly sap the movement's momentum. These Gen Z-led protests, on the other hand, which really started in force in 2024, they often coincide with a single defining event, such as the passing of a controversial law or the breaking of a scandal. And so rather than a slow movement, this is often an explosion of anger, and this often makes it very difficult to predict when they're going to erupt. The Gen Z protests often harness technology and social media, which allows them to very quickly mobilize people, coordinate protests, share footage of security forces using excessive force, etc. The leadership is often highly decentralized, so rather than being led by opposition figures, it's usually representatives, usually through a social media group. A key tagline in the Kenya protests was tribeless, leaderless, partyless. Through these, they have creative tactics such as flash mobs, sit-ins, and roadblocks. So this was broadly true across 2024 and early 2025. However, notably in recent months, we've seen a growing sense of transnational solidarity. And so this is driven by social media. They see protests in Nepal and they latch onto this. And there's the One Piece Jolly Roger flag, which is a Japanese manga and anime series, but it represents anti-authoritarianism. And it has become a unifying emblem of youth rebellion against corrupt authority. Similarly, protest groups are naming themselves, for example, in Morocco, Gen Z 212, 212 being Morocco's country code. And then in Madagascar, you have Gen Z Madagascar, which suggests a growing sense of Gen Z identity to these protests. I believe these protests are just getting started, really, and it's highly likely that there will be more successful Gen Z-led waves of civil unrest, particularly since the perceived success of Nepal and Madagascar in particular. It's highly likely that there will be a broader sense of identity that solidifies. Governments are likely to react with increasing shifts towards authoritarianism, particularly in these countries in Africa and Asia, which often have quite entrenched political systems, certain families dominating or parties which have been in power for decades. It's likely that there'll be an increase in crackdowns by security forces and potential lethal force against protesters. An example was in 2024 after Kenya erupted into protests. Some of the surrounding countries, such as Uganda, severely cracked down on any protest activity at all to prevent potential toppling of the government. So with the increased protests, it's likely that there will be more space for military coups and other solutions, as government concessions will likely fail to placate protesters.
That was Joshua George, sharing insight from our quarterly Global Risk Outlook webinar. This analysis forms part of our Global Intelligence subscription, providing structured updates and forward-looking insight to help organizations stay ahead of global developments. It includes weekly briefings, strategic reports, and direct access to our intelligence team. To explore more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.